The concept of vulnerability reminds us that disasters are not just physical phenomena, but social ones. Kathleen Tierney explains that no matter how large, a physical event such as a massive earthquake or a tropical cyclone is not considered a disaster unless it results in losses to human communities, the things that they value, and disruption of the social fabric. Disasters are marked by death and injury, usually damage to homes and businesses, displacement of populations, short and long-term economic losses, and threats to the functioning of social institutions like education and healthcare systems and the economy. However, the burden of a disaster is not borne equally. Some geographic areas, groups, businesses, or community sectors usually suffer disproportionately. And understanding how and why these disparities exist is a fundamental question for the sociology of disasters. And the concept of disaster vulnerability provides a partial answer to that question. So what exactly does vulnerability mean in the context of disasters? Vulnerability for disasters refers to a set of conditions that are indicative of the potential for loss. This could be loss of life, loss of physical or mental well-being, loss of the ability to function, loss of physical systems like buildings and infrastructure like bridges, loss of livelihoods and personal assets, including wealth and savings, as well as loss of environmental diversity and sustainability. It's really important to remember that vulnerability is not a static entity. It's not a state, but rather it is produced through an evolving set of conditions. Vulnerability production is a process, and it's produced through conditions both current in the present moment, but also historical, the societal development that led up to this moment. And the process of producing vulnerability takes place in your local community, it takes place at the regional and national level, and it also takes place internationally in terms of relationships between countries. Disaster studies scholars identify at least 3 common drivers of disaster vulnerability. The first driver is hazardousness of place. And this is the most straightforward. Particular geographic areas are just more prone than others to events that arise from hazards. Sometimes this is also called exposure. So we know some countries and regions are in more hazardous areas than others. For example, the Philippines is known by disaster researchers as one of the most hazardous places on Earth because it faces multiple hazards, including tropical cyclones, floods, volcanic eruptions, and earthquakes. Though just because it is in a hazardous place, it doesn't mean it has to turn into a disaster in each event. And hazardousness of place can change. For example, with climate change, hazards can increase or decrease, or they can even change form. And vulnerability through hazardousness of place is partially a human production because it's ultimately humans who decide to set up nations and communities in particular places. And these places can increase or decrease hazardousness that the humans in those communities and countries are exposed to. Later this term, when we talk about climate change and infectious disease, we're going to draw upon hazardousness of place to understand things like the spread of COVID-19 related to climatic and environmental factors. The second driver of vulnerability is vulnerability within the built environment. The built environment includes buildings and infrastructure like highways, bridges, electrical systems, and ports, but also other constructed systems like levees, seawalls, and works that are intended to offer protection against extreme events. Tierney explains that here again, built environment vulnerability is related to the likelihood of loss through destruction, damage, and functional degradation. How do you know if there is built environment vulnerability? Typically, this involves analysis of buildings and infrastructure in terms of when they were built, what building codes did they follow, how have they held up over time, have they been maintained or retrofitted, and are they approaching or exceeding the period of time for which they were designed. In the US, for example, many nuclear power plants have actually exceeded the period of time for which they were designed to operate, but their permits have nonetheless been extended, thus increasing vulnerability of the built environment. Some really interesting research by sociologist Charles Perrow in 2006 emphasizes the notion that some elements in the built environment are vulnerable simply as a result of the way their components are related to one another and operate. The electrical power grid in North America is an example. Although the power grid normally operates with really high levels of reliability, under certain conditions, the grid can be prone to cascading and even to catastrophic loss of function. This happened, for example, in August 2003, when what should have been a minor accident in part of the power grid actually resulted in a massive blackout that affected both the US and Canada. This blackout is the best documented case of electrical power service disruption in terms of its effects on safety and health. It began small with a series of a few mishaps that led to progressive degrading and total failure of the power systems in 8 eastern US states and in Ontario in Canada. It started around 2 p.m. on August 14th, and it wasn't until the morning of August 17th that the entire affected system was restored and operating reliably. That is a really long time, and approximately 50 million people were affected by the blackout, including residents of large cities like New York, Toronto, Cleveland, and Detroit. Several reports and studies have focused on the impacts of the blackout on interdependent infrastructure systems in New York City, where, according to one report, subways were stopped in their tunnels, airports halted operations, and elevators stalled mid-ride. Water systems shut down. The communications network was disrupted. Cell phones ceased to work. Emergency response networks were hampered, and automatic bank machines went dark. Many restaurants and shops had to close, and streets were rapidly overwhelmed with cars and pedestrians trying to find their way home. Without air conditioning, many buildings became stifling really quickly. Remember, this was in August, in the heat of summer. Stranded commuters spent the night in train stations, hotel lobbies, and emergency shelters. When the power failed, 400,000 people were trapped on New York subways. The city lost all of its 11,000 traffic signals, and no mass transit was able to operate except for water ferries and buses. As commuters tried to make their way home, streets, sidewalks, and bridges became increasingly crowded. 800 people were trapped in elevators and needed to be rescued. High-rise buildings lacked water because they lost pumping capacity. This blackout caused 90 excess deaths in New York City alone, a rise in mortality of 28%. Death rates were highest for those aged between 65 and 74. Hospital emergency department visits and admissions due to respiratory problems increased, especially among women, older people, and people suffering from chronic bronchitis. Food spoiled without adequate refrigeration, which led to an increase in diarrheal illnesses, and calls to 911 and other emergency services, including poison control, increased sharply. And at the same time, this blackout made the management of illnesses more difficult. Pharmacies had to close, making it impossible for people to access prescription drugs, and hospital operations were compromised. As this example shows, advanced societies are highly, highly vulnerable to power grid disruptions. The grid literally provides the backbone on which our societies depend, making it possible to use the internet and banking services, to pump gasoline, to heat or cool structures, to operate transportation and other infrastructure systems, to supply water, and even to just use grocery store checkout systems. Pero, the author of this study, calls the power grid, quote, the single most vulnerable system in our critical infrastructure. He notes it's vulnerable to attacks through terrorism, remote warfare, and extreme weather events like excess heat and cold, hurricanes, and floods. And this is just one small example of built environment vulnerability. Built environment vulnerability and hazardousness of place can sometimes interact. For example, think about how poverty can shape living conditions. People living in poverty are more likely to have poorly maintained housing, which doesn't hold up as well in the face of disasters, as well as crowded housing, which can facilitate the spread of diseases in times of pandemic. At the same time, people living in poverty are more likely to be living in undesirable areas of the city or region, often closer to the threat of hazards. You're not going to see really wealthy people living next to a nuclear waste plant, for example. And this brings us to our final driver of vulnerability, social vulnerability.